Well, Richard, first of all, just tell us a little bit about what this Ukrainian spokesperson said on Telegram about these North Korean troops.
Yes, well, this is Andriy Kovalenko, who's head of something called the Center for Countering Disinformation, which is part of Ukrainian intelligence, essentially. And he was commenting on a statement made a couple of days ago by the South Korean defense minister, where he said, apparently rather speculatively, that, yeah, there's a good chance that North Korea will send personnel, send troops to support the Russians in Ukraine. And this chap, Mr. Kovalenko, said it's not just that they might, they have already. So he essentially confirmed something that's been reported without much sourcing the last few days in Ukrainian media, that a Ukrainian missile strike last week killed, some reports are saying 6 North Korean troops and injured 3 others at a site in the Russian-occupied Ukrainian territory of Donetsk. It wasn't clear, whether this was true, and even the Ukrainian official has not given any detail yet. But numerous sources, I think, all referring back to the Ukrainian government and intelligence there, are saying that there are now small numbers of North Korean soldiers fighting for Russia in Ukraine.
And is this a sign, Richard, of the growing alliance that people talk about between Pyongyang and Moscow? Putin visited visited Pyongyang for the first time in over 20 years earlier this year. They announced a comprehensive partnership agreement in June. Is this the latest example of that kind of cooperation?
It is very much. North Korea and Russia have a history that goes back a long way, to the Cold War. In fact, Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was essentially a Soviet-trained officer who was installed by the Soviet Union in the 1940s to run this new country, North Korea. But during the course of the Cold War, they had their ups and downs, and the North Koreans became very skilled at playing off the Russians on one side and the Chinese on the other. But in the last year, the pendulum has swung very much towards the Russians. Just over a year ago, Kim Jong-un visited Siberia, where he hung out with Putin. He visited a cosmodrome there. They seemed to be getting very close. And there were reports of North Korean artillery shells, especially being sent to Ukraine, for the use of the Russians. And then in June, as you say, Putin went to Pyongyang, and they had this very, grand visit. It was a state visit. There were, lots of photographs, lots of toasts, and they signed something that they called a comprehensive partnership agreement, which was a bit vague in the wording at the time. But from what the Ukrainians are saying, it involves a lot of arms, not only artillery shells, although they're the biggest component, but also ballistic missiles. And now, perhaps not surprisingly, these boots on the ground. And these people seem to be it's not that the North Koreans are sending infantry battalions over to Ukraine. That's very unlikely. But these are specialist engineers, essentially, who are looking at the North Korean artillery and how it's performing, and we assume helping the Russians to fine-tune that.
It's interesting you say that you think, large-scale infantry is unlikely to be sent by North Korea to Ukraine. But are we moving slowly in that direction? I mean, if you start with the supply of weapons and then you have specialist engineers on the ground, are we moving even further towards more North Korean involvement in Ukraine?
I don't know. I think it's very hard to imagine at the moment that infantry would be sent. I don't think the Russians would want that. I mean, North Korea is very isolated from everyone, including from Russia. When NATO armies go on maneuvers with one another, that's based on decades of close cooperation. They all use the same kit, they all have the same communications equipment, the same calibers of weapons, and they're used to working side by side. The North Koreans don't work with anyone else at all. So I'm not sure that Putin would necessarily be helped very much by a load of North Koreans who didn't speak Russian and had their own very particular ways of doing things turning up. That's not what it's about. It's really about the shells, the artillery shells. The Ukrainians say, the head of intelligence said quite recently that they're now they provided 3 million artillery shells. They're the largest foreign contributor of any foreign government to Russia's war in Ukraine. So, I mean, the Iranians, we know, for example, are providing drones and other stuff, but the North Koreans are providing a lot more. So it's about that, but it's also about having an ally, having a friend, having a supporter, and not feeling completely isolated in the world.
And just finally, Richard, how will South Korea view all of this? Because I think it was the South Korean defense minister who initially sparked this speculation that the Ukrainians then confirmed. Might North Korea's involvement in Ukraine and support for Russia lead to South Korea revisiting how it supports Kyiv?
Yes, that's an interesting question. The South Koreans have not, engaged very much with Ukraine. They've tended to stay out of it. There hasn't heretofore been an obvious gain for them in doing that. The South Korean governments tend to go from one extreme to another. The last one people will remember, was very much invested in terms of policy and engaging with North Korea. And the president went to Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-un. That engagement didn't lead anywhere. The current South Korean government is the opposite. They're a conservative government, very anti any kind of engagement, very ill-disposed to any kind of compromise with the North. So, they have a kind of interest in making this sound as bad as it is, as bad as it could be. I don't think it's going to change their fundamental strategy. I think they recognize that the North Koreans, Kim Jong-un's main priority is facing and fronting off them and their American allies, and that any engagement with Russia in Ukraine is, very much secondary to that. They may, in fact, feel that, although they wouldn't say as much, that if North Korea is distracted into diverting military resources to Russia and Ukraine, that is somewhat to their advantage. But in terms of the North Korea-South Korea relationship, I don't think it's making a big difference at the moment.